I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hi everyone, welcome to the show today. We are going to be talking about Design Diaries, challenging characters versus players. Now, this is Design Diaries. It's more focused on game design of challenging characters versus players, but we'll talk a little bit about adventure design and things that GMs can do as well to challenge characters versus players. Now, when we say challenging characters versus players, it can be in a dichotomy. It can be a trade-off where sometimes you're playing on challenging characters mostly or players mostly, but there can be interesting ways to interlink those challenges. You don't have to be mutually exclusive. You could challenge characters and players in different ways. So it all depends on what your goal is in the tabletop RPG that you're designing or in the adventure and campaign you're designing as a game master. So let's talk about why you might want to challenge characters versus why you might want to challenge players in different ways. So obviously, if you go to an extreme, it's going to create issues. And some of the issues that are created by an extreme have caused fans of games that challenge one or the other of these two things to consider a slippery slope argument, or sometimes give a straw man argument towards what the other kind of games are like. So, for example, a game that one common thing you'll see in RPGs is when a game challenges the players in a way that one or more players don't like or don't want to be challenged in that way, then they will make an argument of like, well, you know, you didn't conjure a real orc and then make me take my sword, take a sword and show you my sword fighting techniques in real life to chop the orc up. So why do I have to do thing X that is challenging the players?
So, for example, the example that's often included with this are role-playing challenges that involve the player coming up with the approach that they're going to use to solve the problem.
It can be almost anything. And also, the coming up with the approach is one of the parts that makes it even more of a false analogy, which I'll get to when we go into the middle. But you see it all the time when someone is like, I just don't even want to do anything. We don't think about the approach. We don't think about who we're going to use diplomacy on. I just roll diplomacy and everybody is our friend. And then if you try to drill down, sometimes they'll be like, well, you're not making me fight the orc in real life. So, like, that's kind of the straw man that you sometimes see from people who think that there shouldn't be any player challenge theoretically. Although, obviously the straw man of you are sent into a real fantasy world and have to do literally everything your characters do for the players is not a realistic alternative. Similarly, the characters do everything is not something that actually shows up in any tabletop RPG or even most computer games except for idle games.
Yes.
And even idle games,
you still have to like decide on your build and
usually have player skill that is more than the most extreme. Now, like something like, I think Progress Quest, like the idle game, literally didn't let you choose anything at all. It just did it all by itself. So if you have something to the extreme of Progress Quest, then it's something that challenges only the character. And arguably not even the character, because I don't think there were any ways that the statistics in Progress Quest mattered. Just the bars would go up and things would be filled.
So no challenge.
So maybe it just doesn't have a challenge at all and is Candyland style non-game activity. But there are middle grounds. Most tabletop RPGs challenge both the characters and the players in certain ways. To give a parallel, which it also happens to be the counter argument for the people who try to refuse to even strategize for role playing because they say that their character doesn't have to swing a sword at a real orc. The parallels are, in combat, normally the player decides which monster to attack and what kind of weapon or attack to use on that monster. You don't roll a check that's called like the monster targeting check that determines like both the mood, because I as the player think we should take down this dragon, but I'm gonna roll a target check. Ooh, it says here that says my character hates devils, and there's a devil spotting the dragon. Even though it's much smarter to take the dragon down first, since I'm the only one who can get to it. I'm going after the devil because I hate devils, and I rolled on this check that decided that for me, and I, the player, had no agency. So you almost always in combat get to pick who you're going to target, unless you're like mind control.
And your character probably has different attacks that they can choose from.
Even if you don't, you might choose which weapon. It's like, oh, there was a skeleton. The party's wizard said that, or the priest said that skeletons are weak against bludgeoning damage. Now, your player is the one who actually decides whether to use like your warhammer or your battle axe.
Mm-hmm.
The character doesn't have a thing. You don't have to roll a check where you say like, how much am I angry at that wizard for like being a smarty pants know-it-all check, and then you roll an annoyance check and like, oh, my character was too annoyed by the way that you like kind of mansplained the skeleton to me, so I'm just gonna use my battle axe just so that you stop being so obnoxious, and then we'll kick you like Brainy Smurf. Like, you don't have that. Usually the player gets to make those decisions, whereas the actual swing and whether it connects is based on the character. At least that's kind of the standard for kind of like a median modern RPG.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about a comment in chat where like the player challenge really begins when you build your characters in the first place.
That's also part of player agency comes in character building. That's definitely true. There can be some games that have pre-generated characters, so not every game challenges the player in that way. But before we go into that, I want to finish what we were doing, which is
sounds good.
Talk about the other half of that attack, which is it is the counter argument of why it's a straw man to say that nobody should give any information about role playing because they aren't swinging their sword, because they are picking their target, they are choosing their weapon or attack type. So when you're rolling diplomacy, at least in a median modern role playing game, when you're trying, I mean, you might not even roll diplomacy first. Mm-hmm. When you're trying to do some kind of role playing challenge, typically, let's say you're like at a ball and there's like 12 different people that you might need to influence or talk to. The player, you might get information from your character's knowledge, but the player chooses who they want to influence, just like you choose which monster to attack. The player also is generally responsible for choosing like what argument or tact they take and how they approach just the very overall approach, not like the specific words, but like it's like I choose to influence the king and I go up and grab him by the throat and start intimidating him. Like which skill
decisions were made.
Which skill you use, and maybe like the overall gist of the argument there is I will strangle you if you don't do it, whereas you could have other things where it's like the kingdom will be rich if they follow our plan. Just like a very basic overall gist of what you're trying to do. And they might role play it out for a circumstance bonus depending on your group, but even if you don't, there's probably in many like kind of standard median, especially D&D likes, there's usually going to be some kind of check. So the character also contributes to this, and you don't just have a situation where the player who's the most charismatic is judged by whether or not the GM likes them and their argument enough to decide to say yes.
And when you're talking about the player who's most charismatic, this gets into, one of the places where player challenge and character challenge can very much diverge, which is when people are having out of character discussions to figure out how to approach certain problems.
Absolutely.
And then the people who are solving the issue are not the people who are playing the specific character who came up with the solution. Like sort of the classic example where you might have a puzzle or a riddle in a game, and the players work together to solve it, but it's not like, the player who's playing the wizard who has the high intelligence is the only one who's allowed to work on the puzzle.
That's right. So in some senses, when there's collaboration out of character, you might consider this challenging the players as opposed to just the player of the character that would be most relevant to that challenge.
Because I found that usually when there are discussions on, like, what is the main strategy we're going to use to approach this area, or how are we going to, like, handle wealth for our group, or how are we going to approach these larger issues, that people will speak out of character too to try to come up with a solution. And they might talk about, like, especially if there are situations where, you know, characters might disagree and the group wants to come up with an idea that's going to be satisfying for everybody. Like, whenever you slip into sort of the out of character register,
right,
you're definitely getting into something that you know is a player challenge.
Absolutely. And so I think a lot of RPGs challenge a combination of characters and players, and if you're very careful about this when you're designing your RPG, you could do it in a way that tends to satisfy sort of like the median player. The problem is that the median player is not the players who are at any particular table. And so it's also good to create an RPG that's a little bit elastic and can handle, when the GM tweaks it, a greater degree of challenge to the characters or a greater degree of challenge to the players.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you'll often see put into adventures that can very much be baked into a system too is when puzzles arise, like some guidance for, like, hey, you know, here's some ways to give people hints, or like just let people roll checks to get a lot more information so that you can turn the player challenge into a character challenge.
Absolutely. Or vice versa. Like when Linda took an adventure that was written by a developer notorious for hating out of character puzzles that only had a check and created a player-based puzzle in it. Puzzles are another major instance where there's big divergence among the player base of multiple RPGs, or just like the populace as a whole, as to whether it's fun to handle them as players or as characters. And therefore, we have an entire episode on puzzles that you can check out that specifically is talking about this aspect of like the ways you can handle puzzles along the continuum. But absolutely, puzzles and role play are two of the ones that come up the most, because they are ones that some people really want to do them and like to like get into them in the weeds as a player. Mm-hmm. Some people really don't want to touch them at all as a player, want their characters to do them entirely. And so you have people who are so far away from each other that they're near the extremes. Obviously, yes, you don't have a role-playing system where everything, like we said, is done by the player or the character, but there are some players who truly do want everything in that subgenre of content to be
like,
done
for example,
by their character or themselves.
For example, someone who would, like, come with a great argument and present it well, and then be frustrated that their character doesn't convince the person because they rolled some kind of a social role and it randomly said that they didn't do well.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's why I am someone who can be frustrated by that. So I like to roll and see how well I do on the social roll before I decide how I'm going to present how my character, the argument my character gets.
We've mentioned this in past episodes because it is one of the top tips to help players who are like that, who want to do their characters role playing, and they get frustrated if they do the right things and then the die rolls really terribly and they did really well and it just doesn't match. Number one tip for that is tell them that everyone doesn't have to roll first, but those players have to roll first. Mm-hmm. Don't even do anything except say what your basic argument direction is, or even maybe not even that. If you can roll and then come up with it if you really feel like.
Yeah, I've done that before where if I roll terribly, I'm like I think I can think of, like, here's a good approach and here's a terrible approach, and like if I roll terribly or well, I'll decide what approach my character uses, because then it makes more sense.
So that will hugely help in that circumstance. Now, if there's someone who wants to solve a puzzle and there isn't a puzzle for them because it's just being rolled by their character, there's not much you can do about that, assuming that you can't or won't design a puzzle, or you don't have enough time to just make a new puzzle just suddenly in the middle of the session. So that's something you have to figure out. Where with like you actually have to change what you're presenting. Whereas for players who want to be more involved than their characters are in role playing, there is that tip of rolling the d20 first that can really go a long way towards.
Or whatever your dice may be, since we're talking design.
It can be any.
Too, yeah.
It can be any die, right? I mean, this is not only for d20 systems. This is true even in more narrative games. This is true in any game where there is a die roll. But some games are just
or a card or other success mechanic.
Fair. Any game where there's a mechanic where your characters are allowed to contribute to the role playing, instead of there are some games where the role playing really is just the player. And yes, if you're the most charismatic person in your friend group, it doesn't matter what character you're being given that week. If they're like a troll living under a bridge with no social skills, you will be the one who convinces everybody every time because you are in real life. And there's some that don't let you talk. The games, and that's okay for all of those games. When I said that for like sort of a median middle of the road RPG, you kind of want to be able to do a mix of both. That's not true if you're kind of making a not as kitchen sinky. If to talk about the kitchen sink scale that Jess, Lauren, and I were discussing on a Roll for Combat episode and kind of like made up, or at least I've never seen before, a kitchen sink versus like niche RPG scale. If you're a more niche RPG that is like, I do this one thing but I do it really well and I don't do other things, then maybe your RPG is never intended to be a mix because the one thing that you want to do works better when it's not a mix.
Yeah, like you could have an RPG that's like this. This RPG is about combat. You don't have social things in here because
it might not have them at all.
This is a game where you are adventurers who are challenging the infinite dungeon.
And so it means that the social doesn't challenge the character or the player. That might be when the game just handles. And it's like, look, yes, you probably negotiated to sell your goods and to get in rooms, but there's just a price that you automatically pay for this, and we're not going to cover any of that. We'll go back to the next encounter in the dungeon.
Yes.
Because that's all the RPG covers. And you can do that. It doesn't have to... Challenging the characters or the players doesn't have to be a characters, players, or both. It's the power set. It can include the empty set. It can include neither. You don't have to challenge anybody. Your game can just handle it. And that is always an option. And don't forget about that fourth option, because it might actually be the best thing for certain players in certain areas. For example, sometimes when players are frustrated by them being challenged in a certain area, and they're like, well, my character should be able to do it. Those same players might be frustrated. They're like, okay, have your character roll. They roll, and they're like, okay, here's my result. It's like, okay, you fail.
You're like, why did I fail to like walk without tripping over my own shoelaces? I'm a world-class acrobat. Why are you having me roll this?
Yeah, they'll be like, I'm a world-class diplomat. I should just my character being good at it means that I should just convince them. Why did the die make me fail? So in some cases you'll find that it's actually failure aversion and not even a player versus character thing that is coming up, and you might decide that for that group, if all the players feel the same way, that there could be certain aspects that aren't challenging anybody because they just kind of go.
Yeah, and I think that, it is an aspect of design that you'll see in a lot of RPGs, that there's a sense of like, these are, there's a certain threshold that is probably above what would be expected for like a regular average person, below which you assume that your characters are just going to succeed because they excel at these types of things. And I see a comment in chat about splitting the difference between, like, character and player doing things where, where they're given a role because there are mechanics to support social encounters, but also role play it. They're okay being tested or testing a player, but ultimately want the character to have a chance to solve problems, which they can't. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the middle of the road.
That's the middle of the road, and that's generally what you're going to see in a lot of games, is that the characters...
At least in a kitchen sinky game, anything D&D like, you will.
Yeah. That the character... There is an ability for characters to be, smarter, wiser, more knowledgeable about the nature of their world, etc., 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 than the players themselves are.
That's right. And part of that is just what I always talk about the GM being the Oculus, the view screen into the world. And so, as the GM, you don't have an infinite amount of time to describe everything that really exists in the world, or even a mental bandwidth to like be a server that processes all of the world. And so, naturally, the players can't possibly have access to everything that their characters have seen.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen another comment in chat about trying to focus on, my character is good at what they're good at and bad at other stuff. There's also that sense by which, there are things that could be that the character is going to be way worse at than the player is. And so, like you were talking about that bridge troll example, where, in many cases, most games are going to be set up in a way that the bridge troll who is very bad at social skills, like the player isn't just going to be able to completely make up for that by having a silver tongue in real life.
So, absolutely. And most of the time when people talk about challenging characters and challenging players, they're talking about there's some challenge that must be succeeded to be overcome that's in the RPG, and do the characters or the players contribute? And in certain games, it's more one of the other. Like OSR style games, it's the player who comes up with ideas. Even for combat encounters, if you actually got into a regular kind of, we rolled initiative and we're both there and we're swinging at each other combat encounter in an OSR style game, one of the things that's famous about them is that you have a pretty good chance to die. But also, the idea is that the fact that you got into the combat encounter on even terms already meant that as a player you didn't do something like start an avalanche or something that fell on the monsters and avoid the combat encounter by using some player shenanigans. But here's the key, though. Challenging the players does not have to mean challenging the players to win. Sometimes it can be challenging, like in the Bridge Troll example, to challenge the players to portray a weakness and to challenge them to fail. But now the problem with this in most D&D likes, such as Pathfinder, is that there aren't a lot of system-wide or mechanical incentives or rails built in that challenge the player to fail in ways that are interesting for the group. Sure, like Pathfinder 2 has critical failures and fail-forward design that makes certain things interesting or that you'll remember from the failures, and it's like, that was kind of funny now that we think about it. But there's not an incentive. You still would rather succeed all the time.
It's not like a system like a Burning Wheel type system where your character's ability to level up and get better requires them to fail some along the way. Or a narrative system more like you might see in some World of Darkness systems where the experience points, the ability for your character to level up and get more powerful is dependent upon following along with the way that they are.
And learning
something new as they go, which requires the character to challenge themselves in some way. So like when you're designing a system, like then thinking about how do you reward failure that expressing the character in ways that are not just like that character is always succeeding at their goal.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on rewarding failure, but real quick, the two main ways to reward failure and therefore to challenge the players to fail in an interesting way for the table is one of the main ways that Linda already mentioned is character progression based on, we learn more from our failures than our successes. That's true in life, and it can be true in the game. So character progression is one way, and the other one is some kind of meta currency that is based on failing or encountering setbacks now in order to gain an advantage later.
Yes.
And so those are the two main ways you could do it, but I say that because those are both so broad that they can encompass almost anything. Like they can be as complex as a system that literally counts up your failures, and if you don't get enough, you can't level up the skill, like in Burning Wheel, or as simple as being like, we're using a a basic progression method that is very simple, but we're gonna give a bonus for these setbacks or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Or, a thing where, or like you were saying, for the currency, it could be, it's not necessarily currency that has to be spent on getting more powerful. It's currency that may be able to be leveraged later on to be more successful.
That's usually what the meta currencies that aren't progression will do.
Yeah, so it's like, okay,
since this bad thing happened to you, you now have a point that can help you, like, escape calamity later on or influence things in your favor.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like some kind of meta currency, like a fate point or a hero point. You could even apply this in your Pathfinder 2 games where you challenge your players to fail sometimes. And what you would do here probably is you have some situation and your players are encouraged to come up with a time where they can propose that they are going to, before rolling, interestingly, like, get an interesting critical failure of that they propose. You decide if that seems reasonable, and if you accept the proposition that the player proposes, they also get an automatic hero point.
Yeah.
For a complication. So here's an example. It's like, my dwarf diplomat is actually very good at convincing people, and we're going to convince dwarves, so I'd probably be even better at doing this. But it might be interesting if we have a setback here, maybe. So I think it would be interesting if the person I went to go convince was my, like, old crafting rival who just can't stand me. Mm-hmm. And so therefore is going to say no matter what.
And is actually going to make it harder for us in the future.
Is going to say no to this agreement for no matter what, and it might require the other characters to go in and convince them and me to leave or some other thing like that, because I've been doing all the diplomacy up to this point. So I want to get into, like, a shouting match with this guy and just automatically it'll gum up negotiations a little bit, but maybe the other characters can solve this problem. And maybe you're like, oh, that might derail things. I think we wanted the dwarves to have a pretty good chance of working with you. Or you might be like, that sounds great. Here, take a hero point. And then the other players and their characters try to solve the issue with your old crafting rival. So there's a lot of ways you can do this in any RPG as a GM. And some RPGs, and the reason this is the Design Diary episode is about RPG design too, are custom built to encourage that with things like in Fate, you can not only can the GM compel your aspects to make you do something and give you a fate point, or you can spend a fate point to not be compelled, but you could suggest a compel on your own character. Be like, I know this is a bad idea, but I think my character might be compelled by this aspect to do it.
Like, I know this is it's dangerous to go investigate this thing, and this character is absolutely just goading me, but my character has this particular thing.
My character, Marty McFly, has a nobody calls me chicken is one of my aspects. And I think that I would probably have to give in when they say, what are you, chicken? Mm-hmm. And then the GM might say, I think that makes sense, and I'll give you a point. Or the GM say, I don't know, I don't think that compel makes sense in Fate. And then in that case, you could decide whether to do it for not getting a point, or just be like, okay, in that case, I will not do the thing that's a bad idea. And so some games have this built in. Sometimes the GM can come up with it on their own, even if the game doesn't have it. So think about the types of ways that players can have agency over their characters by designing things like this. And think about how your system encourages people to approach challenges. Because if you don't have a way of giving meta currency or progression or something, some kind of benefit for being challenged to fail, your players will probably learn that failure is always bad and that they want to just succeed. And they won't get as interested or invested in the kind of cool, interesting complications that failures can bring. This can mean that when you're kind of like learning with new players or starting up a new group, that it could be important when you start off to getting some good habits about these things.
Yeah, because this also leads to certain dynamics at the table where, for example, if there's not a reward for failure, then you're much more likely to see groups that specialize into, like, I am the character who is the best at doing this thing, and therefore I will always do the thing.
And nobody else will roll. You might fail and mess it up.
Which is part of why you'll see like subsystems, for example, in Pathfinder that are designed to say, this is a situation that's too large and expansive for one character to do alone, so everyone has a way to contribute.
Or so there can be a subsystem, where it starts by saying you can't, but it's even more compelling if it's like, well, I guess you could have only the bard try to diplomacy during this influence, but if you only have a certain amount of time, and if only the bard does it, you're guaranteed not to influence everybody, because there's 6 people to influence, and you have enough time to talk to 4 people, and you may need to talk to someone more than once to completely influence them. So even if the bard has loaded dice and a bonus so high that you critically succeed guaranteed, and a critical success was enough to influence someone, you still would only get 4 out of 6 people at best in this scenario. And so it's always worthwhile to have other people. Once you add another factor like time into it, that is a much more natural way to do it. There's other systems like that. There are systems or even adventures. So that would be a design for the game designer or a GM or adventure author that attempt to kludge in having all of the characters work together by being like, the system is like, everybody has to roll once before the other person can roll again, or even having NPCs that are written into adventures that are like,
I refuse to speak to you for more than 2 minutes until I've spoken to everyone in this group.
Once somebody makes a check, this person will completely ignore anything that they say, and will just tell them to shut up anytime they open their mouth again until they've also talked to
at least 2 other people. The
barbarian who's foaming at the mouth and babbling incoherently, and everyone else at the table. And it's like, but why? Whereas when you have something like time or an in-character strong actual reason that causes the players and their characters to proactively split up and divide the challenge because they need to in order to solve it, that's when you have a good way of that doesn't feel artificial.
One thing you'll notice about these systems, like, influence and chases and infiltrations and all kinds of systems that are like, everybody is contributing because time is of the essence, is that they're designed to allow people to contribute in a lot of different ways. They're not going to say, the influence system doesn't just say, like, here's a system where everybody has to roll charisma skills and then if you're not good at it, too bad. It says, well, here's other skills that can come into play, and so that each character can shine on their own unique strengths. Because, like, while you can create a situation where failure is interesting and it's necessary to progress, you don't want that to be something that is regularly required by the design of the system.
Linda knows what she's talking about. She designed the influence system. When it comes to Pathfinder 1, based off of Pathfinder Society Adventures that were designed by Thurston Hellman.
I consider it to be a collaboration between the two.
It went back and forth. Linda designed the system by kind of looking at successful influence adventures, and then it went back and forth. And I guess I designed the PF2 one, but it's heavily influenced on the PF1 one. It's basically very similar, but in a PF2 framework with critical failures and critical successes. So, Kojo is talking about looking as a player or GM at the design of a game to try to understand which of these character or player challenges are being incentivized. That's very important. Because if you don't think about it, you might get the wrong idea. To give you a good example, in Roll for Combat Live, there's a 100% chance that anytime we talk about OSR, Steven is going to be like, it's all about dying. Everybody's dying. They love it, and they love that they're dying. And it's like, that's not... He's like, it's Dark Souls. People love Dark Souls because they just want to die as many times as possible. It's like, that's not what people who play the challenging games, that's not why they play them. But they do play Dark Souls and OSR games for the same reason. And that reason is that they want to not die. But they know that death is very possible if they make a mistake. Especially if they make a player mistake.
Yes.
That death is very possible. Like, in Dark Souls, there's not a build that you can make for your character that is so strong that you can just kind of pay no attention and just run fate like Leroy Jenkins right through everything and just that you'll win. There's some amount of player skill, even though builds actually are important too.
It's about winning in spite of the challenge. It's about overcoming the challenge. It's not about like, oh, I love dying over and over again.
You'll find some OSR players who really don't like dying and who maybe have never died, but they are the ones who are using vast amounts of player skill, which is a very, very one of the like the three fundamental tenets that's actually agreed upon in the definition of OSR by people who almost never agree on what it's even the R stands for and what things are OSR and which ones are not, is that player skill is important. And so the ones who haven't died probably have almost never, if ever, engaged in a fair fight with anything. And that's because they use player skill to like flood the dungeon, create an avalanche, cause two groups of monsters to go against each other, go around the monsters so that they didn't have to fight them, start at like 2,000 feet away with a longbow against a melee enemy. Like,
yeah, create a trap, create a spin an elaborate ruse that allows you to trick the enemies and think you're coming from the other direction, so you can lure them down a tunnel and then ambush them.
Trick the monsters into thinking you're working with them. Like all sorts of things. And they're things that aren't unique to games that are designed around that, like OSR. I've done that. As you know, if you've watched Linda's Adventures Shattered Star, like,
yep.
Like my characters have run scams on on multiple dungeons worth of creatures where they're like, yeah, we're the exterminator, the exorcist you hired to deal with the ghosts.
I don't remember hiring an exorcist.
Yeah, the leader
did. Your
boss didn't tell you about us. We're gonna go talk to the leader, and then when they took us to, we got to the leader. She's like, I didn't hire you, and then we beat her up, impersonated her, and then we were now the boss and also some exorcists, and we're like, yes, these are the exorcists I hired. I'm gonna go into the deeper parts of the dungeon, and then she didn't come back, and only the exorcist did, and we're like, yes, the boss was killed by the ghosts deeper in the dungeon, but she said that we're in charge now. Or actually, no, right before we left, it's like, if I'm going to handle these ghosts, they're dangerous. If I don't come back, this person is in charge, who was already a member of their organization, but was a mole for the party's association, and would never really have been selected as the next runner-up person in charge. But they heard their boss say that, and they didn't have enough time to interrogate if it was really the boss, because she ran down into the dungeon and then never returned.
Never came back, yes, because she was...
So, like, these are the kind of player-based challenges that you can play, and that was in Pathfinder 1, which is maybe one of the height of challenging characters and or challenging the player to build a character that will just automatically win. But you still can play in a style, you know, I've had people sometimes before on Reddit talking about Pathfinder who are like, your group's style seems very OSR. Just because we like to do things like this, even when we're playing Pathfinder first or second edition.
Yeah.
So the game system doesn't force you to... the game system that allows characters to have a lot of agency, even if the players can't solve a particular problem, doesn't force you to avoid player solutions. Now, a game system that literally has no way for the character to do certain thing, like, let's say it doesn't have any social skills.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, they don't exist. And if you read in the rulebook, it says, we intentionally didn't put these in here, so because the player has to do the talking. Then that might be the case where it has to be the player. But there's almost never a case where the player couldn't be given more of the challenge. No, there's almost never a system where the player couldn't assume more of the challenge on their own if the GM and the player wants to, but there are where the character can't assume more of the challenge because the system literally doesn't allow them to.
Yeah, there's not a way to rely on what the character can do.
Right. So I think that I've covered what I wanted to in terms of the dichotomy, going into the middle, the fact that it's more of a mix, that you can go back and forth, you can even alter what people assume your system can do and challenge players or characters more, although sometimes not the characters. Did you have anything else?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little more about where this comes into play when it comes to a discrepancy between player knowledge and character knowledge.
So we do have a metagaming episode, but this is a little bit different than that.
Yeah. So, like, for example, when there can be, like, a considerable player challenge that comes into play when the player knows more than the character does, and then they're trying to, or the player knows that the character is misinformed, and they're, like, trying to portray that accurately.
That's right.
And then, conversely, there can be cases where characters are solving things based on what they know, but, like, the player doesn't even necessarily get into all the details of it, where it's like, oh yeah, you know, you disarm this trap using your knowledge of arcane formulas, but that's entirely on the character, and like the player doesn't have to do like a mini game about arcane formulas.
That's right.
So where the locus of knowledge lies is also an important consideration for this. But yeah, as you said, we did talk a lot more about this in our episode on metagaming, but that is connected. Where, like, especially if the another thing that can come up as well is what to do if the goals of the character and the goals of the player are not aligned.
Yes, that's definitely true, and it can be a little bit tricky. There are some games that actually do have the character, like, it wasn't completely a joke about, like, the character might have to make a roll to decide if they actually wanted to do that. That can happen. That can happen in tabletop games where the character has their own agency. That's part of the idea of, like, compelling the character and giving the player a fate point in Fate. It isn't the character who got the fate point. The player got it because their character had their own goal or idea, and that was not what the player necessarily would have wanted to happen. Sometimes when you play around with the difference between the character and the player, it can lead to interesting outcomes. In tabletop RPGs, even, like, sometimes in computer or video games. Like, I remember there was a JRPG, Baten Kaitos, where you were not actually the main character. You were, like, some guardian spirit who was, like, the you outside of the screen being talked to by the characters. And sometimes they just would not do the thing that you wanted to in the story, and that was a plot point. Or like Majesty, the computer game where you were the king and you placed bounties on stuff, but you had to see whether or not the heroes actually went there. So sometimes playing around with the player and character discrepancy can, like, be part of what makes the game, but sometimes it can be very frustrating to players if they don't have complete agency in what their character is doing.
Yeah, so you need to be careful with that sort of thing. And when I see the other direction of, like, you know, the player is completely satisfied with what's going on, but the character isn't necessarily. Tends to be more when you get into that system of, like, mechanics that reward failure. It's like the character would have loved to make a persuasive argument here, but, like, you've decided to capitalize on one of their foibles to make a more interesting story.
Yep. Another time a player may be satisfied, but a character might not have really been satisfied is, like, if the player's like, yes, I'm that wizard who makes swords, and I'm crafting magic items in my basement for 22 hours a day because I have a ring of sustenance. And maybe it was certain editions where they implied that you could just keep stacking up low-level spells that you have a lot of to remove fatigue and never sleep. It's like, never get exhausted working all day. It's like, I wanted to work 22 hours a day, 365 days a year, except for when I'm adventuring, to craft swords in the basement. And it's like, the player might want to do that because they get more money, but does the character really want to do that?
Yeah. Or like the character who is dragged reluctantly into things where the character's like, I just want to live a quiet life in the countryside, but I keep getting dragged into all this heroic nonsense, and then the character's very unhappy about the situation, but the player's like,
the player wanted to do the heroic nonsense.
Yes.
So there's a lot of situations where the player might be happy and the character isn't, or even maybe the character is happy but the player isn't. And you have to think about that. Ultimately, as the GM, the player is the one that is like sitting with you, possibly over the internet, possibly in the same room that you have to deal with, and their character is not. So if the player isn't happy, then you have much more of a problem.
Yes.
All right. So I think we covered it.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Great. And I think we got all the questions that we had in chat. So let's say bye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube.
Bye.
See you next time.